Okay, so welcome everyone to our online forum on labor and popular struggles in the Middle East and North Africa, organized and hosted by the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America and Global African Worker. Before we begin, I just want to share the basic parameters of the event and introduce our panel of speakers. So first we'll be hearing from Joel Beinin. Joel is the author of Workers and Thieves, Labor Movements and Popular Uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, and the Struggle for Workers' Rights in Egypt, among many other books. He's a member of the Middle East and Africa Regional Working Group of DSA's International Committee. And I should add that he recently published this long-form article that was the inspiration for this panel and shared in the chat, so I recommend that you check it out if you're interested in reading more. Second, we will hear from Rabab Elnaiem, who is a Sudanese activist and a member of the Sudanese Workers Alliance for the Restoration of Trade Unions. She's also a PhD candidate in statistics at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Next on our panel will be Brahim Rouabah, an Algerian activist and co-founder of the UK-based Algeria Solidarity campaign. And he's a PhD candidate in political science at the City University of New York and a teaching fellow at Brooklyn College. And our last panelist will be Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill is a racial justice, labor, and international activist, and he's executive editor of Global African Worker, former president of Trans-Africa Forum, and co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, among other books. So after the panelists' remarks, which will be about 5 to 7 minutes each, we want to give a chance for an exchange among the panelists. So I'll open the floor for the panelists to respond to each other's remarks or pose questions to each other if they choose to do so. And then we'll open the floor to audience questions. And the way that will work is we ask audience members to pose their questions in the chat box, and we will be selecting from the questions and posing them to our panelists. So we're going to try to have people submit to the public chat, but we have had a lot of problems with kind of Zoom bombing and these sorts of things that have been going on with Zoom calls that you may have heard about. So if the public chat doesn't work, we have to switch it. We might have to switch it to having you send me the questions as the host, but we'll let you know if we have to make that switch. We're hoping that it'll work just to have people submit their questions in the public chat. Okay, so without further ado, I'll let Joel begin. Thanks, Joel.
I'm gonna begin by just playing this. Can everybody see that? So I wanted to begin with that because that video became an icon of the Sudanese revolution, but more broadly, it illustrates some of the themes that I want to emphasize that are changes in the most recent round of uprisings and protests in the Middle East and North Africa. Since 2016, and more intensely since 2018, we've seen a cycle of protests and revolutionary uprisings in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Egypt. And all of them are continuations in one form or another of the Arab popular uprisings of 2010-2011. Those uprisings were themselves preceded by a decade of escalating collective action by workers and the unemployed, especially in Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. The deep background for those protests was the imposition of neoliberal austerity regimes and the privatization of public assets promoted by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, backed by the United States and the European Union. A major reason for the more positive outcome of the uprisings in Tunisia was the strong role of its National Trade Union Federation, the UGTT, especially its mid-level and regional leadership, which supported the popular uprising, pushed the organization itself to the left after the ouster of the former president Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, and compelled the deadlocked political parties to adopt what is nominally at least the most democratic constitution in the Middle East and North Africa. A key lesson from those events is that in the Middle East and North Africa, just as in Europe and North America, a mobilized working class is the most important force for promoting democracy. The recent wave of uprisings targeted the same conditions: autocracy and economic austerity, unemployment, and lack of opportunity for youth, with the addition of a new issue, particularly in Lebanon and Iraq, the inability of the state to provide basic services. This is because the main structures of regional political economy and governance have not changed since 2010-2011. Petrocapitalism remains the dominant regime of capital accumulation. Its power and influence radiates outward from the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries. This regime of capital accumulation was consolidated in the period between the founding of OPEC in 1960 and the oil price boom of 1973 to 1981. It is regulated by a mix of patrimonialism, nepotism, and crony capitalism, the supervision of politics by local militaries in Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan, resulting in bloated military spending, the pillaging of public property, swollen bureaucracies, and generalized corruption, social and political instability, the weak to non-existent rule of law, low human development indices, a repressive public culture, and until recently, the prevalence of Islamist movements as the main forces of political opposition. The hydrocarbon poor countries are integrated into petrocapitalism via the remittances of their migrant workers and aid and investments from the hydrocarbon-rich Gulf Cooperation Council countries. The international financial institutions continue, as they did before 2010-2011, to promote the same neoliberal Washington consensus policies that they have touted since the late 1970s. There are 4 salient differences between the social movements of the 2000s and the revolutionary uprisings of 2010-2011 and the current cycle of protest. First, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the 2 most powerful of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, with the full support of the United States, have led the consolidation of a sectarian Sunni axis of counter-revolution. Its junior partners are Egypt and Bahrain, and it includes, incongruously, Israel. Its principal regional target is Iran, and Iran's allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine. Since 2011, this axis of counter-revolution has intervened militarily in Bahrain, Syria, Libya, Yemen, with catastrophic cost in civilian lives. The contours of the popular movement have also changed in 3 ways. First, white-collar workers and university graduates have become more prominent participants in strikes and protest movements. The most important expression of this trend is the leading role of the Sudanese Professional Association from the earliest days of the Sudanese revolutionary movement that erupted in December of 2018. The Sudanese Professional Association includes doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, veterinarians, journalists, school and university teachers, and others. It was formed in 2016 and was an important force in the several waves of anti-austerity protests preceding the revolutionary uprising. The second change is that gender issues and the participation of women have become more salient than they were in the 2010-2011 uprisings. And this is one of the reasons that I began with the video of Ala Saleh, who became known as the woman in white. You saw her standing on top of a car, dressed in a white gown, leading the crowd, chanting revolutions and other slogans against former President Omar al-Bashir. Ala Saleh is a university student in engineering and architecture. Previously, someone with that profile would most likely have been an Islamist if they were a political activist. She's a member of Women of Sudanese civic and political groups, whose Arabic acronym is MANSAM. MANSAM is one of the signatories of the Common Revolutionary Platform, known as the Declaration of Freedom and Change that was issued on January 1st of 2019. As many as 70% of the participants in some of the Sudanese demonstrations were women. 4 women have been appointed to the transitional cabinet, including the foreign minister. This is a significant presence, but insufficient for feminists who are demanding more. And I'll leave it to Rabab to say more about that if she wants to. Women were also highly visible in Algeria. Under the regime of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, they were present in the parliament and the cabinet, but they had no real power, and the parliament altogether had no real power. Women, however, do dominate the fields of medicine and law, and they comprise about 60% of university students. But they have not clearly emerged as political leaders, with the sole exception of Louisa Hanoun, who is the longtime leader of the Trotskyist Workers' Party, which is a relatively small party, and which played a role in the uprising, but certainly not a leading role. And third, the current wave of uprising has rejected sectarianism and ethnic strife. The uprisings in Iraq and Lebanon, which began in October 2019, originated as a response to increased taxes, the high cost of living, lack of economic opportunities, and the failure of governments to provide basic services. But they also explicitly challenged the sectarian apportionment of political offices introduced in Iraq by the United States after the 2003 invasion, and Lebanon's more established sectarian constitutional structure. This posed a challenge to the Saudi Emirati effort to build a Sunni-based anti-Shia counter-revolutionary axis in the region. Also in Algeria, unity between Arabs and Berbers has been a main theme. Berber flags have been flown in many of the demonstrations, and people have been arrested for doing so. There's also been a strong effort to try to overcome the ethnic division that has marked Sudan over the past decades, although that's much more entrenched and quite a difficult objective to accomplish. The popular movements were suspended due to the social distancing imposed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Driven by deep economic distress, nonetheless, there are signs of a revival of popular protest in Lebanon, but I'll defer to both Rabab and Brahim to update the situations in Sudan. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I just want to point that in Sudan time, it's already June 3rd, which is exactly 1 year of the massacre. So I have to start by paying respect to the martyrs of Sudan, martyrs of social justice everywhere. And I would also like to extend a wide solidarity from the Sudanese community, the African Black community in the US in their struggle. In the words of our revolution, freedom, peace, and justice. Okay, so to comment on the current situation in Sudan, I need to look a little bit back before independence of Sudan. Sudan gained independence in 1956. Before independence, we can categorize 2 broad forms of resistance. In one hand, we can think of farmer movement and worker movement. For example, in 1946, we had a 23 day of strike successfully for farmers, and as a result of that, we have a farmer union. And in 1947, we also seen in Atbara the railroad worker forming the very first worker union. On the other hand, we've seen the British empowering certain socio-economical class with some intersection of religion, and those classes were recognized by the British as the representative of Sudan. As a result, they were given the power to negotiate the independence of Sudan. So from the get-go, from the beginning, from the forming of post-colonial Sudan, there was been a division between workers and farmers, like the masses in one side, elite and religious leaders from the other side. And I would like to call this a colonial paradox, and we'll see the effect of this colonial paradox all throughout the 66 years since Sudan independence. I think the article did a really good job in terms of breaking down the social or diagnosing the social economical made up of the SPA, Sudanese Professional Association, and as a result of that paradox, as a result of that forming of the SPA and the FFC, which is the Force for Freedom and Change, the political cover for SPA and for opposition. Currently government, opposition of the Bashir government before. There's one event that I think it's very important to look at and to think about and ask questions about that event. 5 days before the massacre, and by the way, the massacre was not just in Khartoum, the capital, there were sit-ins all over Sudan, and they were all brutally attacked on June 3rd. 5 days before the massacre, the masses of Sudanese people were not pleased with the way of the negotiation. They wanted full civilian authority. They did not see that the military should be part of the conversation. They were very aware of interfering from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. So they pressured the SPA to call for a general strike May 28 and May 29. And the strike was able to push through. It shut down the entire country, ground transportation, airspace, the central bank, schools, small shops all over. It was a successful 2-day strike. One of the really interesting and exciting stories from the strike is the strike of the electricity workers. They obviously was part of the strike, and the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, and other security forces arrested some of the electricity workers. So they retaliated by saying that if you don't release our colleague, we're going to cut off electricity from all security facilities in Sudan. And obviously that's a significant move, and that's a move that will show the power of self-organizing and the power of the working class in Sudan. Although we've seen this successful 2-day strike, the SPA and the FFC did not choose to push further with the strike, and that's why we have a partnership between the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, and the FFC. Basically, the FFC will prefer to share power with the military than face the masses of the Sudanese people. It will prefer to share power with the military because of that colonial paradox, because they understand the military, because they share enough social economical interest with the military. So I think that event of the general strike is very important to understand. One thing I will add is if we look at movement in Sudan after the independence of South Sudan, we see a wave of protest in 2012, 2013, and 2016. All of them were mainly called upon by a younger population that can clearly see this colonial paradox, and as a result does not trust the political leaders. The only other political demonstration wave that was called by a political party was in January 2018, and it was called upon by the Communist Party against a budget that was basically an IMF budget, and they called it the hunger budget. And they predicted that the result of that budget is going to be the disaster that led to the revolution in December 2018. It's interesting that the Communist Party seems to be, at that point at least, the only player that is reading the economical situation. At that time, other countries, other parties like the Umma Party, for example, were pushing further with election in 2020. Just to explain my idea better here, I think to understand why we have a sharing in power between FFC and TMS, it's basically because of that colonial paradox, because we don't have workers. We don't have the masses of the people organized in the SPA, for example, or in the FFC. We have the same social economical interests that will intersect more with the military than it will intersect with the masses of the Sudanese people. I think this is my main input regarding to the article and the situation in Sudan. I will push and let Ibrahim go further with his comment, and we'll see how the conversation advances. Thank you.
Go ahead, Brahim.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
good evening, everyone, and thank you all for making the time to join us tonight. I would like to thank Joel Beinin for the invitation and everyone else who made it possible. It's really hard to sort of both engage, give sort of an update on what's happening in Algeria, and at the same time try to engage Joel's article in 5 to 7 minutes, but I'll do my best to do that. Maybe if I just read every other page of my notes, that would make it easier. But I think what I took away from Joel's article is the centrality of labor as a revolutionary actor in defining revolutionary processes, but also leading them. And to a certain extent, I do agree with that. But I think a look at also Fanon has taught us that strictly speaking, Marxist analysis must always be stretched when it comes to the colonial and, for that matter, the post-colonial world. So maybe if we just look at the history of the labor movement in Algeria, a brief overview like Rabab has just done. The workers' movement, the syndicalism in Algeria, in Algerian society, really was born in the early 20th century, and mainly in the displaced communities, Algerian communities and workers who were in the metropole in France, and they were mainly sort of affiliated with the French Communist Party, CGT, at the time, and but the experience, the racial question came up very early on in the 20s, where we see the creation of the North African Star, which brought together all these Tunisian, Moroccan, and Algerian workers into a proto-nationalist or a nationalist sort of formation in the 20s. That in Algeria itself, Algerians were not able, under colonial rule, of course, they were not able to unionize, and they were not even able to join the French unions because of the indigenous code that was in place up until close to around the time of the World War II. And when that was opened up, almost 250,000 Algerians were part of it. And with the advent of the 1945 massacres that took place in May, in May 45, then also the colonial question came up, and the membership of the CGT, or the communist affiliated union, dropped significantly. In the 50s, with the start of the war for liberation, there were two, in 54, the establishment of the first Algerian-led union took place. 2 years later, it was abolished by the French governor, Lacoste. And then in 56, you have the formation of two unions, the second of which is the l'UGTA, which is linked to the FLN and has been the only union in Algeria up until the opening, the so-called democratic opening in between 89 and 92. So for most of the history of independent Algeria, you had the l'UGT, which is a corporatist FLN-linked union, and I think Joel does a really good job in terms of laying out the history of that union. So unionism or syndicalism in Algeria, at least, and I would dare to venture to say, in the African context and probably in the global South in general, was not linked, at least in the 50s in Algeria, was not so much linked to sort of, it wasn't responding like in Europe to processes of urbanization and industrialization, but more to the colonial or anti-colonial question and the racial question. So African or North African Algerian workers in France had the same experience that someone like W.E. Du Bois tells us in his Black Reconstruction, how Black Americans were treated in unions in the United States. So that's sort of the genealogy of the broadly speaking of the movement. Now, with the opening up, and since the early 90s, in 1990, there was a law that allowed for syndical pluralism, and close to 50 unions were allowed to, autonomous unions were formally allowed to exist, which was in sort of in keeping with the military nature of the Algerian regime, or the military oligarchic nature of the Algerian regime. There is always a facade, a civilian facade, and a facade of civil society that is allowed, accredited or half accredited. They try and allow, to place civil society actors in a legal gray area, where the legislation allows for their existence, but they are not, they would not receive sort of the official accreditation by the government. Therefore, they are they can always be repressed with the justification that they are not accredited, and the activities that they are carrying out are not accredited. In the 2000s is where we really start seeing autonomous union work, especially of what remained of the Algerian economy. In the 1990s, the Algerian economy was deindustrialized. The massive sort of Washington consensus and liberalization reforms were put in place at the behest of the IMF and the World Bank. Hundreds of publicly owned companies were dismantled, and hundreds of thousands of Algerian cadres and managerial class that had been developed in the 3 or 4 previous decades was laid off and pauperized, and and in many cases also pushed into exile. Now, jumping fast forward into the last year and their role in the movement, I think unions have since day one have been part of the movement, a dynamic sort of component of it. But I think it's it would sort of blind us to the larger sort of set of actors that are involved sort of in this revolutionary process. They have pushed, and when I'm speaking about the movement sort of as or the union's labor in sort of a monolithic way, but there are of course, differences between various components of it and the various unions, ranging from the ones that the public administration union, the public administration personnel union, or the confederation of the CSR, the Confederation of Algerian Syndicates, which mainly brings together workers in the education and health system, or COSIFOP, which is the Confederation of Productive Forces, which has been really the most in line and the most aligned to the demands of the movement in Algeria, where the question, for example, of independence, of popular sovereignty, of anti-imperialism, of the sort of the demand to end the military rule or military supremacy in political life in Algeria, has been the only one that has been sort of in line, discursively at least, with the movement. So just to throw there maybe another actor or another sort of space where to see things happening is both, the in the Algerian diaspora, especially the sections that were exiled or pushed into to migrate in the 90s and early 2000s, is the formation of new political an opposition that is also in exile, and has been formed there. And we see, for example, one of the movements, one of the key movements in the Hirak, the Rashad movement, established in 2007, in exile, and making the primacy sort of the civilian over the military in Algeria, and nonviolence as central tenets of its platform. And those, we see those, a civilian, we want a civilian, not a military state, generals to the trash bin, and Algeria will be independent. The modes of mobilization and the nonviolent nature of the mobilization, we see those taken up and absorbed by the movement, yet we hardly see any writings, both in media or in sort of academic writings about these, and they are very representative in terms of responding to the lumpen proletariat, if you like, the unemployed, the ultras and the youth in soccer stadiums and so on and so forth, constituencies that are not traditionally in sort of the realm of union work. So, I mean, I don't want to take too much time. I can always sort of add more in the Q&A session. So, yeah.
Thanks, Brahim. So next up, Bill.
Yeah, good evening. And I want to thank DSA for asking me to participate in this panel. I'm batting cleanup, and so I'm here more to offer some observations and perhaps some questions, beginning with just a thanks to Joel for his excellent paper, but also an earlier paper that he wrote on Egypt that I read several years ago about the labor movement there. When Brahim was speaking, he mentioned in passing Frantz Fanon. My political generation grew up reading The Wretched of the Earth and A Dying Colonialism, Black Skin, White Mass, all by Fanon, who died as a psychiatrist, but also a freedom fighter in the Algerian Revolution. He was originally from Martinique. But in Wretched of the Earth, there's a very important chapter he wrote called Pitfalls of National Consciousness, which I would actually recommend that everyone take a look at, in the aftermath of this discussion. What's interesting there is that Fanon raises a number of very important factors about what was going on in the anti-colonial struggles. For many of us, the role of the working class in the anti-colonial struggles was invisible. Attention was given to the great leaders who were negotiating or leading wars of liberation or whatever. But the working class was to a great extent treated as invisible. And to the extent that the national struggles were frequently framed in terms that were beneficial to the aspiring capitalist classes in many of these countries, there was nationalist terminology that covered over a host of issues and internal contradictions. And in fact, many sectors in various countries, workers, women, various ethnic groups, were told to put their various demands on the back burner in the interest of fighting for national freedom. And many of them did this ultimately to their detriment. In the period after liberation, we had, for example, in the Arab Spring, so-called the Arab Democratic Uprisings of 2011 through 2013, this unexpected to many outsiders, massive set of uprisings that took place in which the working class played a major role. But that working class was not necessarily in the form of trade unions. In certain places, like in Tunisia, most notably, as Joel was pointing out, but also you found it in Egypt in a different way, and in Iraq, you had union activity. But in many other places, the working class role was much more dispersed. And where the working class did not have significant, well-organized formations, like Libya, their demands ended up being eclipsed by other forces. And I think that that's a very, very important lesson for us to keep in mind. A second point that I want to raise, and then I'm going to defer to discussion, is that the uprisings of 2011 to 2013, and to some extent what we're seeing now, had a problem of they did not fulfill their full set of objectives. And not even, and I'm not going to restrict this comment just to North Africa and the Middle East. I was thinking also about Burkina Faso, which during the same period of time carried out a very successful democratic uprising that drove out the Campori regime, that was a neo-colonial regime. And people were looking forward to a new democratic establishment. And the problem was that the revolution did not complete its task. It removed a dictator, but it did not put in place a new revolutionary establishment. There were very many important changes that were introduced in Burkina Faso, but those changes were not fulfilled. And I think we see that in a number of places where the Arab Democratic Uprisings took place, that certain reforms were won in many cases, but the revolution was not completed. And this, to me, seems to be a major question that faces the Sudanese revolution of today and the Algerian, which is, will these revolutions stop short of some sort of more in-depth transformation, social transformation? Will they be limited to introducing broader political democracy, which is not to downplay political democracy? But will they be limited to that, or will they go one step further? One of the discussions that I had earlier today with Danny Postel one of the organizers of this panel, was about what happened in Egypt, where you had a labor movement that, in my humble opinion, was fairly disorganized, but quite vibrant, that ended up being making a strategic miscalculation when an uprising took place against the Muslim Brotherhood regime under Morsi, and they ended up supporting the Sisi regime, the Sisi military coup that paraded itself as being the army of the people. And the labor movement failed to appreciate what was at stake in making this alignment with the Egyptian military. And so these are some of the questions that I think face the current revolutionary movements, and I think that we should expect more. If you look at what's been happening in Iraq over the last year, the turbulence that's been going on that doesn't break down simply as ethnic or religious, but to a great extent is class-based. Where will that ultimately end up? To what extent will we see a resurgence in Iran of a similar movement as we saw a number of years ago? So I'm just going to end at that point and leave it with more questions than answers.
Thanks, Bill. So just to remind people, I know I sort of explained this at the start of the panel, but I know more and more people have been coming in. We're going to have some time for if any of the panelists would like to pose questions or give comments about what each other said. So I will give you all, if one of you has something that you want to ask, I'll open the floor to you. And then after that, we'll have Q&A from the audience. And so if anyone still doesn't know, the way to submit your questions is in the chat on Zoom. Just you can submit it in the public chat, and we've been collecting questions from the chat. And so I will be posing those to the panelists for them to answer. Joel, you want to speak? Please go ahead.
I want to push a little bit further on things that both Rabab and Brahim said. So first, to Rabab, you gave a sociological argument for why the middle-class professional forces are more willing to accommodate with the military. Then the question is, was there actually an alternative? Was there a way to push the military out more decisively, given the balance of forces at the time? And then related to that, I kind of pitched you the question about women, but was the women's movement more satisfied with getting 4 cabinet ministers, which as things go in the Arab world is pretty good, but as actually still pretty minimal? And then Brahim, I want to underline your comment about the inadequacy of a simplified Marxist analysis, especially for understanding a place like Algeria, where not only the history of settler colonialism, but also the divide between the Amazigh and the Arabs and a whole set of other dynamics are interwoven with class dynamics. So you're certainly correct in pointing to that. And if I was misleading in that respect, I apologize. The very end of my article, there's a paragraph that talks about COSIFOP, that's the Autonomous Union of the Productive Workers, which, as you said, was one of the main labor forces active in the movement. And then they had an election and they removed their president, who had been a pretty salient figure in the movement, and replaced him with someone else who announced that they weren't going to do politics anymore. So the Jacobin editors asked me, well, what was all that all about? And I could not find out. I dug around in French and Arabic and couldn't find anything. So if you know something about that, and more broadly, where the current government of Abdelmajid Tebboune, the president who was elected by a tiny fraction of the population in December, what's his attitude going to be toward labor going forward?
So if I may go first.
Please.
Sure. So the question of, I don't think it's just a sociological argument. I think it's mainly based on the economical class, like the different classes, the struggle between these different classes. I would say definitely there was a way out of this partnership. And the reason that this partnership happened is because the masses were not able to organize early enough. SPA had a massive following, huge, never seen in the history of Sudan. And we already have two popular uprisings before in the 66 years since independence. So the following of the SPA was huge, was massive. But I would say the partnership and the lack of role of women in negotiation, for example, the lack of representation of women, real representation of women, not just for the sake of saying we have 1 or 2 or 5 women in the government. All of this is linked to the fact that SPA was built on relation that suffering from that colonial paradox. If we go back and think about the history of women movement in Sudan, we see that women movement in Sudan was always linked to a political party, disregarding class. So how would you expect a women movement to actually advance its cause if it's disregarding an important factor like class? For example, the Communist Party had the very first woman in Parliament, Fatma Ahmed Ibrahim. They pushed for equal pay for equal work. They pushed for very progressive agenda, but at the end of the day was still a certain class. The Communist Party, through its women movement, failed to address different classes in Sudan. It failed to address women in West Sudan. It failed to address women in South Sudan at that time, and so on. So all of this is really linked to the idea that we are still evolving in terms of self-organizing. And one point I would like to maybe point to is the rise of something called the Neighbourhood Resistance Committee. It's basically a grassroots movement. Just people in a certain residential area will self-organize, follow up with campaign for civil disobedience, another form of resistance. And this is a really interesting idea, and it's very similar to the idea of unionization, because you have a group of people who share interest, who can go through the intersection of gender, class, and religion, and have a certain cause that they're trying to advance. So this is a good entrance into the political atmosphere in Sudan. And that will definitely break that colonial paradox, and that will definitely not reproduce the relation with the military, the relation with countries in the region, and so on. So I can kind of wrap up this remark, or like your question, in saying that the reason for lack of representation of women and the reason for the partnership is, like I was saying earlier, is that colonial paradox. And the only way that I see we can break this colonial paradox is through producing new ways of self-organizing. We need to change the way masses relate to the authority of the state. You don't have to go through the very traditional political party that is not recognizing of your class. That is to a large extent a continuation of that colonial relation that will not allow women to actually advance their causes and will not allow different masses of the people to advance their causes. So I would say that the way to go, and I am hoping that we're heading in that direction, is producing new way of involvement, new way of self-organizing. We need to redefine the way as masses relate to the power of the state, not only through political parties, through different type of self-organizing and choosing your right allies, like choosing someone and choosing a group that actually share your real interest. I think that's it. Ibrahim, I think you can go ahead and add your comments.
Yeah, just to quickly sort of respond to Joel's question regarding COSIFOP, the COSIFOP election. Look, the military oligarchy in Algeria, at least since the 90s, right, has really changed the doctrine of the Algerian military to adopt the French school of counterinsurgency, because the people who carried out the coup in 1992 are all sort of 7 out of 8 generals were actually officers in the French army. Some of them fighting for Algeria to remain French in the 50s and early 60s. So the way they approached the Algerian population is through a framework that this was a war on civilians, and it's a war for dispossession. It was a period of accumulation through dispossession for a whole decade, and then the acceleration and compradorization of this military oligarchy in the last two decades. Now, what they needed for that is to crush any social organization, any form of political organizing that fundamentally shakes or puts into questions their legitimacy. Be that an NGO, be it a trade union, be it a political party, any form of organization that threatened that, it would be crushed and decimated. Another way of doing it is infiltration of these organizations and imploding them from the inside. A third tactic was the cloning. So in Algeria, if you have two main human rights organizations, for example. One of them that was, a real one that emanated from struggles and popular struggles, and activists who had struggled for years or decades for sort of a human rights, and then the regime would create one with almost the same name, but with people that it controls, that the political police controls, and would not make a statement if it's not okayed by sectors of the intelligence, military intelligence. So what happened to COSIFOP in the last month was the same thing. The political police sees that it's on the side of the people, radically on the side of the people. It's adopting the language of the popular movement, and it's not willing to play nice, to accept sort of the facts on the ground that were created by the regime. So they started a movement, an internal redressive movement to push the president Raouf Millal, who's currently in fact in Switzerland, and COSIFOP on the 20th, I believe, of May, organized a general assembly, and they called on him to stay outside of Algeria for fear of his life. So the first statement that the new president that they put in place and that the General Assembly of the Union rejects, is to come out and say that we should not make statements. Whoever wants to make political statements should join a political party. So that gives an idea of where they want it to be, and that gives you sort of answers your follow-up question about the attitude of Tebboune or people who brought Tebboune into power towards unions and syndicalism in general, but also any independent autonomous political force in Algeria. Please let me know if I left anything out, but I don't want to sort of gloss over the question that William Fletcher had asked about the sort of whether these movements are bound to or there is the possibility for them to fall short of or go further. I want us to to remember that over at least since the last decade, the forces, the counter-revolutionary forces in the region have been, obviously, the United States has played a major counter-revolutionary role. France, the United Kingdom, Israel, but now with the regional subcontractors and the role that the Gulf states, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have been assigned in both sort of the capitalist global order in terms of finance in the Emirates and so on, and for Saudi Arabia through its oil wealth. And the sort of the role, the counter-revolutionary role they played in Tunisia, in Libya until today. In Tunisia, in fact, there was a week or 2 weeks ago, there was a coup attempt against the elected president, with elements linked to the Emirates, but not only. So at the level, the counter-revolution has local agents, has regional agents such as Egypt now and under Sisi and the Gulf states, and the international cover, great power cover that Europe and the United States provide for them. The goal for them is to keep a weak, illegitimate military oligarchy in Algeria and turn it into a militia, turn it into a mercenary force that could be used and abused in Mali and in Libya and Niger and the Sahel as so they want to turn Algeria into a subcontractor for imperialist designs in Africa, at least in West and North Africa, and therefore the sort of the support that both Gulf and US and French mainly, the support that they have always given to this regime, at least since the 1992 coup d'etat, is still unwavering. And they have supported them in actually just to now they are pushing them. These are the concessions that the military oligarchy is forced to make to imperialist powers, is to, in their what they are calling the new constitution, they are trying to allow or to take out the stipulation that the Algerian military cannot intervene outside of its borders, and that's basically in 2013, before the fourth term of Bouteflika, he was being pushed to send the Algerian military outside because the French and the Americans, they don't want to send their own soldiers. They want to rule the world through the Khmer Rouge and through colonial and indigenous militias. So, and that in 2013, they escaped that by saying they provided logistical support, intelligence, the opening of the airspace for French warplanes to bombard the Mali, but they stopped short from sending people in uniform. And now that's the next stage of the integration of Algeria into an imperialist, militarist project, neo-colonial project in Africa. So the movement, it will, I believe it will go further because it's very much aware of this, conscious of these stakes that are involved. We know that contemporary imperialism wants to impose these militaries. We see it. They want to impose Haftar in Libya. They want to keep, the Algerian generals in power. You have Sisi in. That's the plan. That's the plan. That works for the Zionist project and works for outside forces that see Africa in general and the global South as a farm or an extractive farm, that, and a source of cheap labor. Yeah.
Okay, so this segment went on a little bit longer than the exchange for panelists than I had previously set time for. So just so we get the chance to get some of the questions from the audience, which we have some really good questions, I'm going to move on to the next part of the questions, if that's okay with our panelists. Do you have any kind of burning questions you want to ask each other? No? Okay. Okay, so we have still about 50 minutes left, according to the time. So I probably can't get to everyone's question, but I will try. And again, as I said, if you have questions, anyone in the audience, please just write them in the chat, and then I will feed them to our panelists. So we had a question from Samar to Rabab. She said that you mentioned this division between the worker unions and religious leaders as being a result of colonialism. And she's wondering in what ways it was a result of colonialism, and in what ways do you see it as paradoxical?
Okay, so the division I meant in the political atmosphere. I meant that if we go back and check the history of Sudan, the fight for independence of Sudan, we see that trade unions, worker unions, farmer unions were formed before independence while the British were still ruling Sudan. But at the same time, the British, among closer examination, used certain religious leaders, for example, Al-Ummah and Al-Ittihadi, as a way of helping them to govern Sudan while they were still in power. And it's easier for them to have a proxy from Sudan to help govern Sudan. And they recognize that proxy. Like, why would the British, we should ask the question, why would the British decide to negotiate with what is called, if I may translate, I'm going to mention the name in Arabic and in English, Ittihad al-Kharrijin, Union of Graduates, basically, so which is like an elite union that was responsible for the negotiation for independence of Sudan. The British, when this union tried to approach the British, they were not recognized, and they had to go under the wing of religious leaders. So from the get-go, we were not able to involve the working class, farmers and workers, into the process of forming the political leadership of Sudan. As a result, we had that paradox. If we look at the very first coup, like Sudan got their independence in 1956, and the very first coup was 1958. So in 2 years. In reality, it was not really a coup. It was a civilian government handing Sudan to the military. There was a lot of issues within Sudan. Obviously, it's a brand It's literally coming out of colonization. So instead of the government having to deal with its people, is decided to hand over Sudan to the military. And when we examine the social and the economical relation between the military at that point of time and the ruling party that gave basically Sudan to the military, we see that they're coming from the same socioeconomic class. They were definitely not workers, they were definitely not farmers, they were farm owners, they were landlords. And we see this over and over again, even through the second dictatorship of Nimeri, we see the financial gain that those political parties were able to make. At the end of the day, the military and those political parties, one way or another, maybe with the exception of the Communist Party, but all other parties, including the movement of Muslim Brotherhood, were able to gain a lot of power, a lot of financial power, and a lot of social power in Sudan during dictatorship. That's why I see the alliance between those political parties, those political leaders, and the military. And in my mind, it's a paradox because you see it over and over again. This contradiction, you see it over and over again. It's like a vicious cycle that we're locked in. But like I said, I'm very optimistic with this new way of self-forming. I'm optimistic for unions. I'm optimistic for self-organizing. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thanks, Rabab. We have a question from Israr about whether there is any kind of transnational unionism in North Africa, and if not, what are the obstacles that are preventing solidarity between these North African unions? I assume that can be posed to anyone of the panelists who feel equipped to answer.
Bill, do you want to address this? I think this is really your thing, if you want.
Bill, you're muted. You should unmute yourself, Bill.
No, I'm staying muted when other people are talking. No, I'm not. I'm gonna ask you, Joel.
Okay. So the short answer is no. There is not a lot of transnational union connection and solidarity. And this is part of a much deeper and broader problem, which is that Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were all colonized in slightly different ways and different times by the French. And each of those three countries during the colonial period and still today, their main international partner is France. So for many years, if you wanted, for example, to fly from Rabat to Tunis, you had to fly to Paris first. There was no road that went across North Africa connecting the three capitals of those countries. And in terms of economic activity, Algeria, for example, specialized in producing grape wine, grapes to make wine. Muslims don't drink wine for the most part. Of course, there are many dissenters from that, but on the whole, they don't. Well, who drinks wine? France drinks wine, so of course you sell the grapes to France. Tunisia and Morocco are major phosphate producers. Phosphates are used to produce fertilizer. Who used most of the fertilizer? Well, it's mechanized agriculture that uses fertilizer, and that meant France and other European countries. So they're even at the level of basic economic activity, these three countries didn't have all that much to trade with each other. So yeah, you had some cross-border arrangements and connections. So like in the southwest of Tunisia, in the Gafsa phosphate mining basin, there was a lot of cross-border connection with Algeria, and a lot of the more radical elements of the Tunisian National Liberation Movement were connected to the Algerian FLN. But Habib Bourguiba, who was more Francophile, smashed them. So even those elements of interconnectivity that did exist were crushed, if not by the French, then by the post-colonial regimes.
And I'd just like to add to that, and then there were the contradictions certainly between the governments of Morocco and Algeria. The Moroccan monarchy itself did not believe that, well, let me put it in a different way. The Moroccan monarchy basically believes that everything from to the west of Tunisia and going down into Mauritania is really Moroccan. And this led to major problems like a border war and the contradictions between Algeria and Morocco around the Western Sahara. So that has also had an impact on the ability of these labor movements to work together.
Thanks, Joel and Bill. We have a question from Karen asking if the leaders of the movements in Sudan and Algeria articulate any kind of well thought out economic program to address the material grievances of the working and middle classes. Rabab, you look like you want to answer that one.
It's very frustrating. It's really is very frustrating. So there is a really big struggle right now in terms of economical reforms. We see the current government, the current sharing, the current partnership between the FFC and the TMC still leading the way of the IMF, still going for the same neoliberal package. We just had a couple of weeks ago, we had a raise in wages for all governmental workers. But then again, what is the percentage of people who actually work for the government versus people who work in unorganized sector or the private sector? So it's definitely not a fix. It's basically a way to, it's delusional. I don't know how to put it other than it's delusional. And it's, I think it all goes back to the fact that the interest of the current government, of the current partnership between the FFC and the TMC is okay with having a new liberal agenda. It's enough change for them to maintain the status quo, which is basically their privilege. They're not trying to go across, and it's a result of not having not including enough of the Sudanese people in the process of forming the government. Like I was saying earlier, and I feel strongly about this. If we had a better forming of the SPA, if we had a wider participation, even the women movement, like Mensam, for example, are they really part of the FFC? Or are they just by name part of the FFC? Do they have a say in the economical reform? Right now, we see the Communist Party trying to fight on this IMF package, but at the end of the day, it seems like the Communist Party is not able to choose its ally the correct way. At the end of the day, they're still trying to basically be in bed with something like, with a party like the Ummah Party. Ummah Party, just to give like a context of what is the Ummah Party, Ummah Party in the May 28, May 29 came out against the strike. For the first day, they said that the strike is not going to succeed. And when the first day was very successful, they came out again and be like, well, we just don't like a strike. Obviously, they don't like strike. A strike will liberate the worker of Sudan, will create a new balance between the working class and between employers. Ummah Party is mainly employers. obviously it's not of their interest to do that. So unfortunately, the official direction of what is so-called the revolutionary government is definitely an IMF, with the exception of what is the Communist Party is trying to fight for. But we still see that, for example, a couple of days ago, we had an agreement basically saying that you can give people direct money, basically. But then again, do you have the infrastructure to actually access the poor nation of Sudan? It's all just basically the IMF strategy. Ibrahim, if you want to add to that.
Yes, the question about the economic, you don't have one economic program in the in the sort of the popular movement, the Harak, because it's not a political party. Harak has everyone in it. However, what there is consensus about is that this is a fight to get the state back, that the current military oligarchy is doing everything to break this state, and after having sort of after the retraction of the so-called of the state over the last 3 decades, now we're moving to the destruction of it, and the way that they are sort of throwing their weight in Libya and Mali sort of fall within the designs to eventually the sort of break up the territorial integrity. So there are 3 key red lines for the movement: the unity of Algeria, so a scenario like in Sudan, or a de facto division in Libya, scenario in Sudan in 2011, 2012, sort of the breakup. The scenario in Syria, those are out of the question. So territorial unity, the unity of the military, because the critique in Algeria of the movement is not of the military as the military of the people, that a military that does its job, that stays at the border and does its job, but rather the military leadership that has hijacked the military and has in fact pauperized and swindled and siphoned off the sort of the resources of Algerians and of the military personnel, the regular soldiers and small officers who are suffering immensely, and who are clearly on the side of the movement. So the unity of the military and the unity of the people. So anything that is all these sort of divisive discourses or incitements to discourse about sort of ethnic divisions between Arab and Berber, all these incitements to discourse on Islamists, secularists. That's how Sisi came to power in Egypt. That's how the sort of the potential of the Tunisian revolution was stunted in Tunisia, albeit sort of still a relative success. And those are sort of the unity of the people is the third red line. So the referential the reference here is the declaration of the 1st of November 1954, which started the Algerian anti-colonial struggle. That is a consensual set of principles for an Algeria that is popular, that is democratic, that is social. So the social state, the social nature of the state is key, and that does not crush. So within within principles, Islamic principles, largely speaking, that a state that does not crush the identity of the people or imports a certain form of secularism, or especially in its French iteration, that is inherently anti-religious, even when it is itself becomes a religion. So So the social nature of the state, the critiques that we hear, that the sort of everyday people would be talking about, the defunding and of the healthcare system, the defunding of education, of social services, the retraction of the state that had taken place over the last 3 decades. Those are unacceptable. And also unacceptable is for the military to get 25% of the budget, of the state budget, yet we still have soldiers who have to buy their shoes outside, or not have enough food to fill their stomachs at the end of their day. So those soldiers and those rank and file of the military are asking, where are the $11 billion that you get every year? Where are they going? So the social justice is there, is a key and central element, but the obstacle to it, as the slogans on the streets have it, is that generals to the trash bin and Algeria will be independent.
Perhaps I could broaden the answers that Rabab and Brahim just gave, because I see it as a regional strategic problem, which isn't all that different from the problem that we face in the United States right now. All of the historic political parties have exhausted themselves, have nothing to offer. There are this or that tiny leftist party like the Workers' Party in Algeria, or even in Sudan, where historically the Communist Party was an enormous force, but it was crushed and has never really reconstituted itself in the way that it was. And Islamists filled that void for a while, but I would say that in the last several years, they have also shown their hand, and it's empty. So now when people rise up to rebel, and they will continue to do it, whether the current cycle of protests succeeds or not, or to whatever degree it does succeed, there is no political platform that they can look to. And on the one hand, that's good, because it means that people have to organize themselves, as Rabab suggested, with the neighborhood resistance committees from below. But on the other hand, that means there is very little in the way of national coordination, which is what's required to overthrow an incumbent regime and establish something different. So this is why Sudan, for all of the weaknesses of the Sudanese Professionals Association that Rabab has pointed out, is in better shape than in Algeria, because the Sudanese Professional Association was at least a nationwide organization that could play a certain coordinating function. In Algeria, there isn't any organization like that. It doesn't mean that in the end, Sudan will be better off than Algeria. It just means that right now, in neither Sudan nor Algeria, nor in any other Arab country, nor in the United States, do we have a popular party that advances a program that the vast majority of the people can embrace.
Thanks, Joel. So for the next question, we had from Marie. Sorry, I just lost it. Okay, Marie Helmi. So she said, Brahim mentioned race as a factor in the politicization for Algerians living in diaspora. Would any of you say that race is a relevant category when discussing revolutionary struggles in the Middle East? And in what ways is Blackness relevant to these social and political spheres? And if you have any thoughts about the current moment in the US.
Rabab, do you want to answer that, or should I?
Go ahead. I'll just comment after you. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, race. I think I mentioned the race in terms of in relation to the to colonial times, early 20th century, the experience of Algerian workers and unionists in the diaspora, especially in France. And just sort of the parallel that I tried to make, sort of to make it maybe more sort of palpable to folks in the United States, is sort of the experience of Black trade unionists and Black workers in the United States. And I think I can't put it more eloquently than W.E. Du Bois has already done. Issues of the racial wage, and the exclusion of Black workers from unions, and let alone sort of union leadership. So that's the context. That's the context in which this comes up. The questions of race and anti-Blackness, particularly, if I understand the question correctly, has not been sort of posed in the movement. Yeah, it's not a central. It hasn't been a central. So racialization has been, or processes of racializations have been posed, but not sort of Blackness or anti-Blackness per se. The forms of racializations that you see in Algeria are more sort of the Islamophobic or Islamophobic sort of positions that are hiding behind secularist masks. That's really what and it's usually dog whistling to certain establishments, like the French establishment, official establishment, and elsewhere, but not understandings of race as anti-Blackness. No, not in Algeria, at least.
Well, may I just say, lucky you. I run the risk of blaming too much on colonization. I think the minute we start talking about it, it's a slippery slope, but I'm willing to run the risk to explain my point. So Sudan is definitely, like, even if we look just at the geographic where Sudan is definitely in the African continent, and then we'll see different tribes within Sudan. For example, I come from a region in Sudan where my mother language is Arabic. But do I have the features of a typical Egyptian or a typical Middle Eastern, for example? I don't even have necessarily the feature of my younger brother. And this is just an artificial way of looking at the issue. But when maybe I should have led earlier with that colonial paradox, the separation of South Sudan, for example, separation/independence of South Sudan. It might look to someone looking from outside at it's an anti-Blackness sentiment, for example, in Sudan, and to a large extent it is that. I feel like there is that race issue in Sudan, and it's also originally linked with religion also. If you're Muslim, if you're not Muslim, the British kind of dealt with Sudan in two ways. The northern part of Sudan, they allowed more of like agricultural projects and the railroad and so on, where they closed the southern part of Sudan and they opened that to Christian missionaries. As a result, you have school, education in general, health, life opportunities like house, livelihood linked to the church. And to a large extent, you can think of Christianity as being introduced one way or another linked with colonization. Even Islam in itself, it was introduced in Sudan through colonization, whether about the Turkish or the Egyptian at some point of time. So definitely there is a race issue. And one of the interesting parts about the current revolution in Sudan is the slogan of all is Darfur. And we've seen the previous government, Omar al-Bashir government, trying to blame this entire revolution on a group of students from West Sudan, from Darfur. And we've seen the Sudanese people coming out against that and in support of Darfur. But at the end of the day, again, the FFC and the SPA is made of the same social economical class, the same social economical class that was with colonization, was during all those 66 years of independence between dictatorship and not so much dictatorship. So at the end of the day, there is definitely an intersect of class, religion in Sudan, whether it's a social class or it's an economical class. So there is definitely a wider issue of Blackness in Sudan and a struggle with identity. Are we Arab? Are we Afro? Are we Afro-Arab? And maybe this is why, for example, in my social media feed these days, there is a larger solidarity with the Black community in the US, because we do recognize this issue and we do see it. We're struggling with it. So definitely there is a deeper race issue in Sudan.
I think for people in the US, by and large, we don't really understand race in Africa. And one of the big mistakes, including by US African Americans, is to assume that there's a common understanding about what it means to be Black. So for example, I went to Mauritania a couple of months ago, and there were people that were darker than me that called themselves white. And they weren't like just hallucinating. What they were, race and color, we all, I mean, it's almost a cliche to say it's a social construct, but it is. And it is historically situated, and there are issues of power, control, in some cases, the legacies of empires, but mostly about capitalism and the way that capitalism is operated. And so this is one of the problems that many US African Americans had understanding the Rwanda genocide. The same year that South Africa became free, and when many of us were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, we didn't quite understand race in South Africa either, truth be told, but there were at least white people there. But then you go a few miles to the north and you go to Rwanda, and in 90 days, close to 1 million people are wiped out in what could be called a racial genocide. But from the standpoint of those of us here, it looked like, wait a minute, all these Black folks, what are they doing to each other? And so when someone says this thing about anti-Blackness, it sort of depends on what you mean. It's just like in looking at Latin America, the issue of race is very complicated, and many US African Americans and going to Latin America just simply don't get it. And this ends up having, presenting complications in terms of solidarity. So it's really important when we're looking at the continent to not begin with the frame, with the lens of the US experience, but begin by seeking truth from the history and the struggles that have gone on there, particularly the class struggles, issues of colonialism, in order for it to make sense.
Thanks, Bill. We had a question from Isaac to Rabab about what role the sort of self-identified organized left has played in the revolutionary process in Sudan. So I think he means kind of outside of the labor movement, but sort of more explicitly political left, what kind of role they've played.
I'm not really sure self-organizing left. Um, if he's talking about the Communist Party per se, this is, as far as my understanding, is a self-organizing left movement. I would say that the introduction of new ways of organizing, like the Neighbourhood Resistance Committee, um, I would not want to I would not want to impose um, the description of left, um, just because I think they go beyond. There's also a big issue of terminology. What is left and what is right? In Sudan, it's usually exchangeably used with religion, which is definitely misleading and not realistic. It doesn't have to do with real life, but the terminology still is still used left versus right. They're not used in terms of an economical. They're usually misused not for economical reasons, but for religion. Like, are you with separation of religion and state? Are you for state and religion, and so on? So I would not. There is a lot of younger population movement that are organized, for example, something called Grifna, Fed Up basically, and Change Now. But all of this movement seems to be people who used to be in the Communist Party, but they weren't able to advance with the Communist Party, or they were students who were in unionization. There is also a big unionization between democrats, independent, and communist among students. So they usually used to belong to these groups where they were students. But then again, their role was clear in 2012, 2013, 2016. And like I was saying, I'm not sure if I mentioned this actually or no, but they were not able to build the momentum of their movement. They were not able to build enough social acceptance to push further. They weren't able to involve the masses of Sudanese people. And we like, if we look at 2012, 2013, 2016, they were mainly pushed by, again, I would be very careful in calling them left. I would say left leaning, but I don't think there is an organized left right now. Recently, in 2012, we've seen several communities advancing. We have a journal for the workers of Sudan, which is doing really amazing work in terms of, for example, sanitation workers had a strike for a long period of time. They were able to um, uh, create a social movement around worker demands. I think we're starting to see an organized left, but still in the very early stages. And it has a lot to go further. Will it form some sort of an alliance with the Communist Party? That question really depends on the Communist Party, I think. And might have mentioned this earlier, it seems like the Communist Party is failing to realize that they need to form allies with the masses of the people rather than a party like the Ummah Party, for example, which is the current trend. So I would say there is more to go. There is spark of hope for an organized left, but not quite yet.
Thanks. So I had a question sent in the private message. So someone wanted to know about how the current pandemic and social distancing is shaping political developments or stalling political developments on the ground, if organizers are able to continue kind of doing their work, or if everything has been put on hold, just like what has been going on in the context of the pandemic in these countries.
I'm assuming that this question is for me and for Ibrahim, right?
I assume so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So today is first anniversary, the annual anniversary of the massacre for breaking up of the sitting in Sudan. And I've seen calls for social distance, but at the same time, taking to the street because we still don't have results. We still, the committee that was supposed to investigate the brutal attack still did not come out with any results. So people are very emotionally charged. And I've seen like the SPA has called for several socially distancing, corona conscious basically marches on the street. But at the end of the day, I feel like there is a lot of hold in terms of the political advance. Social media is doing is playing a big role in this. It seems sometimes in Sudan that a lot of politics happens and a lot of decision and a lot of opinions is formed over social media. So there is definitely a way to move forward within Corona, but right now definitely it's halting the political behavior, especially for traditional worker unions, because these are sectors of the Sudanese masses that don't necessarily have access to internet. So like, how would you expect them to organize and to work together? If we're talking about younger population and population that is mainly organized in neighborhood resisting committee, they're still able to push further. But workers and even professional, I feel like they're behind. Maybe it's just a matter of age. They're just not as familiar with technology. It also has to do with if they're able to afford internet, if they're able to organize in this new way. So it's definitely halting the bigger picture.
Yeah, with the COVID-19, the Algerian regime is not the for the Algerian regime, the COVID-19 is not the main problem. For them, the problem is a people in revolt contesting their legitimacy, telling them that you're illegitimate, you've hijacked the state, we want our state back, and we will wrench it back. That's the context within which COVID-19 comes. So for the regime, the first enemy is not coronavirus. They do not look at this as a public health issue that impacts the population, and you move from there to solve it. But the rationale is, how can it be used to break this movement and break its back? Over the last 3 months, they have arrested over 120 bloggers, journalists. They've closed, just in the month of April, they closed 5 media outlets, Radio M, Maghreb Emergent, just to mention a few. They have passed, they have amended the penal code to add sort of these strange and elastic infractions, such as, defamation of a public institution. So and using that to arrest people for posting a Facebook post criticizing the military appointed president Tebboune. So there are people now in jail 18 months, put in jail for 18 months for simply writing on Facebook that Tebboune is not my president. So what they've used this period to do is to put in place a legal framework of repression they know that with the remember that Algeria's income or Algeria is dependent on oil export and gas exports, hydrocarbons in general, for 97% of its foreign currency income, and 60% of its budget or its budgeting of its GDP. So, so with the fall in oil prices, there is no way for them to buy social peace as they did between 2011 at the start of the Arab Spring to 2017. There is no way they can do that. The finance law, 2020 finance law that was passed in September last year, sort of positions the government in a way that it would eventually might have to resort to foreign borrowing, i.e. the IMF and the World Bank. They have instituted over 13 new taxes, which impact the most vulnerable stratas of society. And they just yesterday they passed the complementary finance law, which brings in additional taxes on the most vulnerable and price rises for gas. You know, people will have to pay a lot more at gas stations moving forward. So they know that the Algerian regime is heading in a direction where it will be bankrupt pretty soon. The foreign exchange reserves are that have been sort of cushioning this are running out fast, and so resorting to the IMF, further liberalization and further surrendering of national sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and military sovereignty, political sovereignty. That's what's happening. So turning the military into a militia, opening up for foreign multinationals, especially in the oil and gas sector, and with the new hydrocarbon law they passed in the fall of 2019 is an indication of that. So that's what they are heading. They're heading into more compradorization, to be more a regime that is more more like a house slave than a master in their own country. So it's more, and I guess this with the COVID, they're not the only ones who have been doing this. The sort of repressive apparatuses have been put in place in multiple places, and especially in the region, at least that I'm aware of, in Tunisia and Morocco, and we're seeing it here. It's actually past 8, and I'm in New York, and I can't go outside. So so there is a deepening of the security state. The COVID has been used as a cover to deepen the security state, to further dispossess the people, as you saw, at least here in the US, with $2.2 billion to the stimulus package, with over 80% or 90% of it going to sort of billionaires, while you have 30 million people at least who have filed for unemployment over the last few months. So what do you do with those when you can't satisfy, as a state, if you can't satisfy the needs of the people, their health needs, their food, their shelter, their housing, and their basic human rights? What states tend to do is to turn into fascism, and to turn into more repression. So more liberalization, turbo capitalism brings with it totalitarianism. These are two that go hand in hand, and they are inseparable. The more unequal a society becomes, the more it will have to be, the more repressive it will have to be. If you can't feed them, you have to beat them into silence.
So I think it's important to make some distinctions, because not everything is as bleak as Brahim just ended on the note that Brahim just ended. So Algeria, Sudan, and Egypt are the 3 countries where the military has had the dominant role in politics for decades. And that's why when all of these things were happening, beginning in 2016, you had only a very weak two-week-long popular movement in Egypt in late October of 2018 that was crushed. Late 2019, October 2019. But Lebanon is in a different zone. It doesn't have a strong military at all. It doesn't have a strong state at all. And as a result of the popular uprising in Lebanon, a new president was essentially installed without an election, Hassan Diab. And the currency collapsed because the international financial institutions wanted them to float the currency. And now the currency is valueless. So here's a state which already for decades doesn't meet the needs of its people. All those things that Brahim said that this is going to be happening in Algeria, it was long past in Lebanon. And moreover, the strongest power in Lebanon is a force that claims to be one of the anti-imperialist forces in the region. That's Hezbollah, which is allied with Iran. And people are very angry at Hezbollah now. So people, for those reasons, were much more able to come out into the streets and have been doing that in recent days, despite the fact that there is still the pandemic. It didn't hit as hard in much of the Middle East as it did, certainly not in the United States or parts of Europe. It's too early to tell whether there is going to be a continuing popular movement in Lebanon. But because of those differences, what's happening in Lebanon now is quite distinct from the situation in Algeria and Sudan, where the military can crack down. Iraq is in a kind of intermediate state because the government, as in Algeria, depends heavily on hydrocarbon revenue, and the prices are down, but there hasn't been a resurgence, as far as I'm aware, of a popular movement in Iraq. That's still in abeyance.
Thanks. One last point from Brahim. We really have to wrap up though, so just please keep it brief.
Right. No. I just wanted to say that the intention is not to paint a bleak picture, but to say what to be aware and face the actual conditions against which these peoples are struggling. So humans do make their history, but they tend to do so in conditions not of their own making. So I think the mobilization that we see across the United States or elsewhere in the region are very, there is nothing bleak about that. In fact, it's very encouraging that people are on the streets and they are sort of standing up for what is right and saying enough is enough. And it's the same thing. I believe that it's the same thing in Algeria, that it is in fact the movement that had suspended the the 2 weekly marches. It's not the government that imposed that, and it's the movement. Now we will see with the sort of the hopefully soon the resolution of this COVID-19. There is already talk of going back to the streets in the next few weeks, and this time even the sections, the minority that they didn't come to the streets, or those who were sympathetic to the movement and did not come to the streets, have seen that there is no way for this sort of situation, the current situation, to continue, and they will join the movement. So the movement will come back stronger. And the organization, there are organizations in Algeria that are capable. It's just not the traditional ones that people look out for. As I was saying, there are organizations and movements outside also of the country working on that, who are capable of taking over. I know I took now too much time, but I just wanted to make one last point that I forgot to make earlier in relation to the article. I think on the when it comes to Algeria, there is a subsection that Joel has, which talks. It's entitled "The Electoral Trap," and in the first paragraph there it says. The army insisted on early presidential elections to prove that order was being reestablished and set the date for December 12, 2019. The Hirak sought to delay the vote so that opposition political forces would have time to organize and compete on equal footing with candidates of the regime. I just would like to push a little bit against that the movement did not seek to delay the vote. It sought to it said not, and it does not seek to compete on an equal footing with the candidates of the regime. It wants the candidates of the regime gone and the regime gone, and those candidates of the regime and the regime to be actually to pay for their crimes, to be imprisoned, not to be competing in elections. So this was not to say just wait for us until we organize ourselves. No, that we are organized, and if if the regime is trying to know what kinds of organizations are there and to have representation and leadership that can be exiled or assassinated, that's not going to happen. The organizational capacity is there, and it will come out when the time is right, when they are ready to put down the key. We'll send someone to get the key. But for now, the people will stay on the streets, and we will not. They will not accept sort of a top-down sort of facts on the ground kind of solutions or half solutions. Sorry to have taken so much time. So.
Okay, so I think we're now at the end of our time for the program. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you again to our panel of speakers, Joel Beinin, Rabab Elnaiem, Bill Fletcher, and Brahim Rouabah. And again, I would recommend you check out Joel's article, recent article in Jacobin, and that's kind of the inspiration for this panel. And thanks again for just coming and all your great questions. And please stay safe.
Thank you, Ella and Carrington and Danny, for organizing, and to the other panelists and for everyone who came. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And this recording will be sent out to also people who weren't able to attend. So at some later point, you can expect for DSA to send out the video recording of this.
Thanks,
you.
Ella, for a great job moderating. And thanks to our speakers, really excellent. And thanks to everyone for joining in on the call tonight, given how many other things are going on in the world. And thanks to Joel for writing the article that occasioned this, this process that led to our discussion this evening.